Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. Hello, friends and enemies and neutral parties of the internet. My name is Nathan Dickey, and you are listening to A Leap of Doubt. Very soon, you will be treated to what turned out to be a fantastic and very thought-provoking discussion that I had with psychologist and author Dr. Valerie Tarico. So even if you stumbled across the episode on accident, you may want to stick around. But before we get into that interview, I have a few announcements and shout-outs I want to go over. First, I was recently a guest on Minnesota Atheists Talk radio show, episode number 455. I had a great time talking to my friend Hertzy, who hosts that show. We talked about religious apocalypse in cinema. We talked about the Christian fascination and obsession with end times theology and how that preoccupation has spilled over into Christian storytelling, especially films such as the 1970s cult hit series A Thief in the Night and more recently Left Behind. Christians have been novelizing and dramatizing their own end times scenarios as interpreted from their holy book for at least 100 years now. I'm interested in what this says about religious believers, in this case Christians, need to fill in the gaps in their own narrative of where they fit into history and to assuage the disappointment felt by the fact that their savior has not returned. And so this is what we talked about on that episode, which I'll have a link for in the show notes. Next, I would like to give a couple shout-outs to the work of two friends of mine. One of them started a new project, and the other one revamped after a long hiatus. First, there's Jeremiah Traeger, whom dedicated listeners of my podcast might remember from episode number 3. He was one of my guests reviewing and analyzing the television series Black Mirror. Jeremiah has started his own YouTube channel dubbed Gerb the Humanist that I think you should really check out. He has so far made videos discussing humanism, epistemology, social justice, science, skepticism. Gerbs has also created a podcast to accompany his videos, consisting of hangouts with other humanist thinkers and activists. So go check that out. Second, Chris Watson, whom I'm very lucky to call a friend, has returned to podcasting after a 3-month hiatus. Some of you will probably know Chris as the host of the Podunk Polymath podcast, or Triple P for short. He's back, and his approach is different, both in terms of technical format and in his approach, which I think is going to serve him and his listeners very well going forward. In his new episode, number 72 as of this recording, Chris talks about sexual assault awareness and Pride Month with our mutual friends Amy and Nadia from the Ginger Snaps podcast, which is also delightful, by the way. So check that out. Give Chris some love as well. Thank you, Jeremiah and Chris, for putting yourselves out there, and I, for one, look forward to following your work. And now, without further ado, my interview with Dr. Valerie Tarico. Welcome, listeners, to episode number 14 of A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates questioning, curiosity, and free inquiry, because the only thing anyone should not doubt is one's own capacity and ability to doubt, to change one's mind in light of new evidence or knowledge newly learned. Critical thinking is difficult, and it's a skill that must be learned and cultivated, but everyone is capable of applying skepticism to their own cherished beliefs. One of the most difficult things to seriously question is the values and vision held by one's own tribe, religious, political, or otherwise. Group instinct and tribe loyalty are built into our DNA. The challenge is compounded when schisms begin to develop within one's own tribe in response to a larger outside threat, perceived or real, to the values the tribe holds dear. This is what we are seeing today within the liberal progressive movement broadly. Even before the rise of Trump, the infighting was starting to become more and more evident. And now with Trump in the White House, it seems as though progressives, among whom I count myself, are on the verge of tearing each other apart. My guest for this episode is Dr. Valerie Tarico, a psychologist, writer, and social commentator who tackles religious fundamentalism, gender roles, reproductive empowerment, and the intersection of these three. She joins me on this episode to discuss the power of political mythmaking and cultural storytelling and try to understand the confusing and often frustrating dynamics that we're currently witnessing in much progressive discourse, or in some cases, debacles. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tarico.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So let's start by talking briefly about your background, education, and interests. Where are you coming from, so to speak?
Physically, I'm coming from Seattle, Washington. My background is I have a PhD in counseling psychology, worked for a number of years as a therapist, first in a children's outpatient clinic and then as an independent practitioner, and then spent most of the last 10 years working broadly on progressive political change. So I see myself solidly on the left half of the political spectrum, meaning that my priorities have been around environmental sustainability, education policy, environmental policy, and climate, and fiscal policy that has to do with being able to kind of have a more equitable distribution of wealth, et cetera. And then in the last 5 of those years, really my focus has narrowed more closely to 2 sectors. One is that I write and speak publicly about Christian fundamentalism because that is my background. I'm a graduate of Wheaton College, of the one in Illinois, the Billy Graham one. And then secondly, increasingly, I have focused my time and energy on, as you said, reproductive empowerment, because I realized that the question of whether people are able to decide when and whether to have a child and with whom was an upstream factor and either partial solution or problem multiplier in virtually every other equation that I'd worked on, starting with children's mental health, family stability, marital stability, empowerment of girls and women, education, poverty, peacemaking, the existence of other species on our planet, and climate change. Whether you're talking about the power of an individual to take care of themselves and the children that they already have, and to shape the course of their lives, or whether you're talking about our aggregate impacts, this seemed like it was one point where I could work on a broad range of issues and have an impact on all of them.
I agree. I think there are certain issues that once you settle on something, there are so many applications that kind of branch out from that, and there's like a ripple effect. I think reproductive empowerment is important as well, and I actually did a podcast, episode number 7. I talked to 2 women, one who worked in Planned Parenthood and one who actually related her experience of abortion and kind of shattered the myths around the procedure. And it sounds like you were working on a more large-scale issues surrounding that. I was kind of narrowing it down to individual experiences, but I think it's all really important. So it's really great to hear that you're doing that work.
Well, thank you for having that focus in one of your podcasts. The other thing I would say that I have that's a little bit different than some is that I actually really think that we need to be talking about male reproductive empowerment as well, which sounds odd to people who think that men, kind of have been having their way, if you will, for millennia. But the reality is that if you think of family planning as a human right, then we really could do better for the 50% of the human race that has a Y chromosome, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, the best contraceptive technologies available for women at this point, that most effective, have an annual pregnancy rate of below 1 in 500, state-of-the-art IUDs and implants, for example. And guys are still relying on technologies, the condom that's almost a century old, that you actually have to roll on your penis every time you have sex, and it has a 1 in 6 annual pregnancy rate. And then once there is a surprise pregnancy, really the decision does have to, I think, default to the person most affected, which is the woman. But that's not to say that guys are not profoundly affected by that, right? A guy can have his educational plans, his hopes and dreams for what kind of father he wants to be, who he wants to partner with. All of that can be shattered by a surprise pregnancy. So I think we don't talk enough about the millions and millions of men who would love to be able to manage their own fertility better because they have very concrete dreams about what it means to them to live well and to partner well and to be a good dad if they want to.
And that also ripples out to other areas like the unfortunately decreased emphasis on, for example, men being stigmatized for being raped by women or being domestically abused by women, or anything like that. There's a stigma there that should also be addressed and resolved, I think.
Absolutely. And, maybe this brings us back to the topic that you kind of wanted to center in on for this podcast about rifts within the progressive movement, because I actually think that among some progressive folks, it's not comfortable and maybe even a bit looked askance upon to talk about the fact that guys, too, have a hard time with these things, right? Because, when you think about sometimes the ways that Me Too has played out, I personally think that it was long overdue, much needed corrective, and that I'm really glad women are speaking out about these experiences and that that's going to be less tolerated. But also there is this context in which men end up feeling like they're not allowed to say, I don't do that stuff, right? Or, God, sometimes sexual intimacy is super complicated and it's not really clear who wants what. Or, there's all kinds of things that have essentially, we've ceded, I think, to the right wing, these complexities and nuance and kind of, in some ways, just like the right, I think, loses track of the fact of the full humanity of a whole bunch of people, often women, foreigners, people of color, etc., that I think sometimes we on the left, in a reciprocal way, lose track of the full humanity of people who are perceived as traditionally oppressors or privileged, right? And we lose sight of people's individuality and the fact that their own lived experience is very different.
Yeah, and to get right into what we're talking about, that nuance that you were describing is lost in the very act of storytelling. And storytelling and myth does have real world power, and nothing is ever just a story or just a myth in the way that parents might say to a young child. What is it about stories and myth making that has such power to affect change in society on large and small scales?
Well, I think that we human beings are inherently storytellers. It is how we make meaning of the world around us and our own experience, and then how we use our stories to kind of not only describe what's going on, but to predict what's going to happen and to guide our own behavior, right? So if you look at the world in all of its complexity, if you look at it through the lens of scientific inquiry, or just if you kind of step back and try to kind of map all of the causal factors that go into something as simple as a person's decision to turn left instead of turn right, or the existence of an apple, something very simple, right? That there are layers and layers of dimensions of causality, and especially in our own behavior and in kind of social and cultural trends. The complexities are not only impossible for us to completely tease out, but they can be, especially in this information age, overwhelming. And so we are naturally storytellers. The stories help us to kind of simplify and distill and kind of in our minds get clear on what we think is the trajectory, what led to what, and what's going to lead to what. And I think in this information age where more and more our capacity for distilling and processing all of the info coming at us is increasingly, it's not what we evolved for. And so more and more we are relying on, I think, simplified versions of stories and storytellers who we identify with to tell us what's up and what to do about it and what to care about.
In the context of big history, there's not much difference between the way our species is living now in the information age and taking a hunter-gatherer from prehistory and just plunking him down in the middle of New York City. In the scale of the time that the Earth has existed and our species has existed, there's not really a significant difference between that. We, as a species, are still in our infancy, and we aren't used to our own development in a way.
You know, one of the ways that humanity evolves is culturally, right? So we, the cultural transmission of knowledge, we are social information specialists, and cultural and social evolution far outpace biological evolution. It's one of our great advantages, but it also means that we can end up with our bodies and our minds and psyches optimized for an environment that is pretty different from the one we're living in.
Yeah, you have written a 2-part series of articles about political and cultural narratives, the kind of storytelling we've just been describing, and how these stories we tell ourselves and to each other clash in interesting and revealing ways. You have identified 3 main narratives that currently, and for most of history, I think, dominate and have dominated the cultural and political marketplace of ideas. Let's start with the ancestral story. Who's telling the story and what is it about?
Well, I say that the ancestral story is one that a lot of cultural conservatives in particular fall back on without even realizing it, and that we all have embedded in us. And this ancestral story, in fact, I would say probably emerges out of human biology, but it's the idea that men, you know, it's the story in which there is a kind of hierarchy of human beings that's been established by God. You know, if you think about, and I kind of grew up with the Western monotheistic version of this, the Christian version. And so, you know, kind of the way I describe that in my article is I say, God is in his heaven, his appointed authorities are in their appointed positions on earth. And when that's the case, all is well with the world, right? So there's this value on hierarchy that provides order and stability. And each of us has his or her place in the proper order of things. And as we know from time immemorial, this has meant men over women, over children, bosses or masters over workers or slaves, some chosen bloodlines over others, powerful tribes and civilizations over the weak, and human beings, of course, over other animals. And with you kind of you can see that hierarchy of creation articulated to some extent in the Genesis versions of the creation story, for example, and or throughout the Old Testament and New Testament and Christian history, European history. But you also, if we kind of tweak that story a little bit, you know, it could be one God, it could be many gods, it could be there's variations on it, but like basically that story has existed all over the world, and this and then with some cultures being more hierarchical and more rigid about kind of these structures that create stability and define people's roles and their lives in order to, under certain circumstances, I think, create a kind of flourishing.
It's very change averse because humans, as part of our biological nature, I think, fear change to an extent. I think this goes back to the savannah where we sought out safety and security from predators. And I think that has kind of expanded to match our conception of the environment around us and to the whole planet and finally to the whole universe, where we want safety and security at all times. And any perceived change, even change that necessitates a change in our way of living, is looked upon as unnecessary or evil. It's kind of what psychologists refer to as solution aversion. And because, as you say, it's embedded so deeply in everybody, maybe even in our biology, social progressives also have this tendency kind of lying under the surface in maybe the same way that the reptilian brain and the tendencies that it produces kind of lie under the surface of everybody's psyche.
Yeah, when I wrote this article about the ancestral story, I titled, I was writing a series about political narrative, and I wrote this simple idea as the title. The simple idea is the reactor at the heart of the conservative Death Star. And then I actually changed it to humanity's Death Star because I realized that this kind of idea of hierarchy, of some people having more value than others, innately ordained by God or gods, essentially, or, in more modern terms, simply by evolutionary biology, that this is something that's it has a certain appeal to liberals as well. And if you look at the traditional hierarchies, they really derive from a simple idea that I just called might makes right. So it's really about physical power that men control and protect women and children in this narrative, and ultimately, if you look at the Old Testament text, for example, which the New Testament does not repudiate, ultimately own them. They are property, and the rules that govern harms or injuries against women and children are property laws, not human rights laws, but that it comes from physical power, right? And if you look at, again, throughout the Bible and throughout much of the human history that is based on the Abrahamic religions, part of the way that people are blessed by God is because they are powerful. And that is physical power, that's amassing wealth. And so there's all of these signs in many ways that even though, you've got the Beatitudes and, the author of Matthew putting those words in the mouth of Jesus, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc. But the reality of the broader narrative within within Christianity and within the Bible is might makes right.
You brought up some examples from popular culture of the way this ancestral story kind of shows itself in subtle and not so subtle ways in socially liberal and progressive stories. You brought up Wonder Woman and Black Panther, and I think those were really revealing and illuminating examples of the way this ancestral story is still kind of underneath the surface and trying to come out of the new stories we're trying to tell, at least since the Enlightenment.
We still get sucked back into it, right? So of course it's easy if you talk about this ancestral story and derivative social structures, kind of, then it's easy to kind of look at some conservative priorities and say, oh yeah, they fit that might makes right thing: strong military, gun rights, nationalism, the sanctity of the patriarchal family, racial favoritism, the oligarchic government, unfettered capitalism, etc., the freedom to pollute, a deep wariness of outside tribes, all of that, you can sort of look at it and say, really, whether you're talking about sort of libertarianism or whether you're talking about the instantiation of traditional cultural scripts and narratives, that in one way or another, they do come from this, like, yeah, if I can, I can, right? If I can, I have the right to. But then when we talk about something, it's a little closer to home when you talk about something like these movies that we have loved, progressives have loved, Black Panther and Wonder Woman, because they really are about upending, challenging those traditional power hierarchies, right? So you have females and you have people who have been oppressed suddenly being the ones who are powerful, and yet ultimately what both of them kind of fall back into is this physical power, this blurring of physical power and virtue, right? And I think one of the incredible scenes that reveals this in the Black Panther story is that wrestling at the edge of the precipice, right? Where there's this unquestioned idea, because it goes so far back into our ancient culture, not just in Africa, but in many cultures, that if somebody is physically stronger, then that means they are better, then they have the right to become the king or the ruler. If they can win the battle, if they can kind of kill their opponent, whatever it is, then somehow people say, okay, well, I guess he's the guy then, right? He gets to tell us all what to do. And not only do we say that, well, that's going to happen and it sucks, but we have no choice about it. Sometimes we do say that. But in many cultures, there's a script that gives legitimacy other kinds that legitimately grants other kinds of power to somebody who has physical power.
And I thought of another example of this in kind of a different way, where I look at liberal and moderate Christians who are trying to make something new out of the old system of their belief and religion, and kind of bring it into line with modern sensibilities, with science, with Enlightenment principles. A really stark and interesting example is the Episcopalian bishop John Shelby Spong, who has written numerous books challenging Christian belief and yet holding on to something he calls Christianity, and it's really vague and it's really hard to define. It's really hard for myself personally, reading through his work and works of similar authors, to understand what it is exactly they're holding on to. But they are holding on to something that harkens back to the ancestral story while challenging its most stark, its most visible manifestations in the world today.
Yeah, so what happens, of course, within Christianity, too, I have to kind of give credit where it's due, that there are a lot of stories in the Bible and in the Old Testament that are about compassion, that are about lifting up and caring for the vulnerable. They are about, kind of what's called the prophetic voice in Scripture. The same thing, and it's just that we give very mixed messages about this, right? And even in those Bible stories where they're talking about compassion or generosity or forgiveness or whatever it is, that's very different. To say that there should be this sort of benevolent hierarchy is very different than saying actually the most vulnerable and disenfranchised or most powerless should get to rise up and ask for equality. That's an entirely different thing than talking about a benevolent hierarchy. And so when you look at, again, coming back to some of our favorite myths on the left, whether you're talking about Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, or as I kind of had mentioned, Black Panther or Wonder Woman, right? There's this idea of privileged bloodlines that, ironically, it's kind of particularly bizarre to see that in a story that is about Black empowerment, right? Because that's the whole problem, is this idea of privileged bloodlines, that your value is based on your parentage, and some bloodlines are more valued by God himself than by others, right? But you see that kind of pervasive in these stories that appeal to us at a deep mythic level.
The next story you talk about is the social liberal story, rooted in the Enlightenment and Enlightenment philosophy. Talk about this story.
So the social liberal story is a reaction against our ancestral story that we've talked about. The idea of that people are valued based on their own individualism, that they have freedom of thought, freedom of religion, that we ourselves are the architects of our society. We get to decide whether they are hierarchical or egalitarian, and that there is this idea of broad participatory power rather than God-given hierarchical power. So these are the ideas of, the French Revolution, liberté, égalité. I can't speak French, fraternity. I speak Spanish, not French. Or of America's founders' fathers, right, who said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Now, they were blinded by their own era, and when they said all men are created equal, they actually meant men of European descent. But there were these profound and radical ideals in that, right? That contradicted the deepest tenets of the ancestral story. And, at its finest, what liberal commentator Van Jones has said is that America's founding reality was not so beautiful, right? We talk about Thomas Jefferson having slaves, that there being still women having incredibly few rights, but that the founding ideals were beautiful. And the arc of our history has been a series of fights to bring our reality into line with those ideals and to expand the Enlightenment's revolutionary project of addressing who those ideals apply to, who counts fully as a person and a citizen, right? So not just men of European descent, but generations have fought and won battles to expand that circle of full personhood, bringing in religious minorities, the descendants of African slaves, laborers, women, American Indians, queer folk, so it's, and this fight is ongoing, right? So this is a multi-generational fight for inclusive personhood and associated rights. And I think that's part of what makes the whole social liberal project progressive, if you will. It's this quest toward a promised land that we all create together, in which individual capacities and preferences trump lineage and biology. So it's this quest, in each story, I think there is this arc of who are the heroes, who are the villains, what's the quest. And this is the quest that was described by Martin Luther King. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So that sits solidly within that liberal Enlightenment tradition. And obviously, King didn't live to see the day, and nor have we yet. And I think it's some of the frustrations with this Enlightenment project that have then led to the emergence and kind of salience of a different progressive story, the one that I call the structural oppression story.
Yeah, the social liberal story is kind of groundbreaking in another way historically. And I think one of the best anecdotes from history to illustrate this is that when Thomas Jefferson was writing up the draft of the Declaration of Independence, one of the first drafts read, "We hold these truths to be sacred," which, of course, is an appeal to the ancestral story in a lot of ways. Benjamin Franklin suggested that he change that to self-evident, because knowledge is power, and if the populace, the masses, the people have access to knowledge, that empowers them to create a democracy and to challenge traditional hierarchical power structures. And the structural oppression story that you just mentioned takes a different approach. In a lot of ways, it wants to tear things down and start over. It's grounded in neo-Marxist critical theory, and it's more than just a reaction, isn't it?
Well, it's a reaction, I think, against both the ancestral story and a reaction against the limitations and frustrations of the kind of social liberal story. So, the social liberal story really is rooted in this idea of our shared humanity and our unique individualism, right? And that's a stark contrast to the, there's this old saying that is like, in some ways I'm like no other person, in some ways I'm like some other people, in some ways I'm like all other people. And so the first part of that our unique individualism, and the third part of that, our shared humanity, are really the focus of the human rights, of kind of struggle of social liberalism. And it largely is a repudiation of the tribalism and kind of, those characteristics, shared characteristics that form the basis of justifying who gets what kind of roles in the ancestral story. I'm like some other people, I'm Black. I'm like some other people, I'm white. I'm like some other people, I'm a male or female, right? And then that provides the script. Well, in the structural oppression story, it also is focused really on that centerpiece, the ways that we're like some other people. So the ways that we are essentially born into tribes. And the way I tell the structural oppression story is something like this. All capitalist societies, including especially the European democracies and US, were built by oppressors on the backs of oppressed people. So modern America was built by stealing land from American Indians, commandeering the sweat and blood of Black slaves, keeping women in the kitchen, oppressing brown-skinned immigrants, and exploiting Europe's former colonies. And then virtually all social ills are perceived to derive from this fact, structural oppression, and redressing this wrong is the quest that, and it's the idea that if we can fix this structural oppression, then that will take care of most of the problems in our society. And as I said, it's a reaction to both of those two earlier stories. And, and what I would also say, of course, is that I think that there are very profound truths in that, and that the social liberal narrative has to and Quest has to a large degree ignored
Mhm.
how very powerful membership in tribes can be in terms of dictating somebody's access to freedom and opportunity.
Both stories have value. Neither one in isolation tells the whole story, but that's the kind of sense you get if you just look at the kind of discourse that's happening today among progressives. The story, the structural oppression story, in a lot of ways lends itself to people dividing themselves up into smaller subgroups. So you get the sense that the social liberal story is in bed with the wrong side or the evil side. It's not active enough. It's not outraged enough. And on the other hand, of course, the social liberal story, people who cling to that often miss out on some of the issues that are important that are raised in the structural oppression story. So I think both have important things to say, but neither one in isolation tells the whole story.
Well, that's certainly my perspective, and it's what I articulate in my article. Here's why some progressives are tearing each other apart, which can be found at my website, ValerieTarico.com, or at Alternet. But what, I think is that, yes, what happens is that people grab onto these partial truths and then treat them as if they were the whole truth. And again, that I think comes from our desire sometimes to oversimplify, to have something, a clean, simple set of explanations. And it also comes from, I think, when the more emotional we are, the more frustrated we are, the more we tend to fall into that kind of oversimplification and to be righteous about our partial truths, right? But the partial truths are, if you look at the social liberal kind of story, it really is the thing that is radically at odds with humanity's multimillennial history, right? The idea that our shared humanity across tribes is precious, and that our unique individualism within tribes is precious, and that these two things have been denied or suppressed for most of human history along tribal boundaries, right? That is real. And that challenging those structures that have been imposed on us has allowed a great deal of, like personal development, people being able to live the lives of their choosing, to, as I said earlier, to form the families of their choosing, to pursue their interests, to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And then you've got this other piece of reality, which is that the deep wounds suffered by only some groups, or disproportionately some groups at the hands of others, need to be recognized and redressed if they are to be healed. That under this ancestral story, not everybody suffered so much, right? It really did create stability and well-being for some people, just not everyone. Just some folks got left out, or the well-being and stability for some got created at the expense of others, on the backs of others. And that as we have struggled to upend that with the Enlightenment kind of quest, if you will, that again, some people have benefited more from the struggle than others have.
Yale professor and writer Amy Chua, in her new book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations, writes, if you then, following conditions of oppressive rule on the part of minorities, inequality, if you then introduce democracy suddenly, you are not going to get peace and prosperity like Americans often expect democracy to bring. Instead, you are often going to get payback time, where the long resentful and suppressed majority will use their new political power to come after the dominant minority. And this is where, in a lot of ways, anti-oppression becomes anti-liberal, as you put it. So in what ways can the structural oppression story that we've just been talking about actually end up undermining the very goals of social justice advocates? I think we've kind of intimated at and hinted at how that can happen already.
Well, I think, ultimately one of the questions is, sometimes people get kind of sucked into this, almost creating what I would describe as an inverse hierarchy of oppression, right? So I live, as I said, in Seattle, where the context is very liberal, and culture doesn't change simultaneously, kind of in synchronicity. So you can have people who are white supremacists marching in one part of the country, and you could have people who on the other coast or on a coast, as I kind of experience sometimes, are kind of creating dynamics in which, in some advocacy organizations, you have this sort of almost pecking order where a queer female immigrant of color would be at the top and a white male able-bodied kind of prosperous whatever would be at the bottom. And then it operates really like any pecking order would in terms of the ideas of people at the top kind of getting more salience and more attention, that people at the bottom are supposed to listen and defer and kind of do what they're told, right? So that, I think, in and of itself, I kind of ask, like, is that really what people are after? Maybe some people are after just simply the idea of like, it's our turn, it's time to kind of flip this thing. But I think a lot of progressive activists really want something that is different than that really is more egalitarian. And then I think the other thing is that when you really make a person's tribal identities the most salient, most significant part of their person, that you actually feed tribal competition, right? So I don't think that the identity politics on the left are the sole cause of this fearful white nationalism and kind of male liberation stuff on the far right. But I do think that it fuels it, right? So that you have this reciprocal back and forth with people kind of amplifying each other's concerns and feeding each other's worst fears, if you will.
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways it becomes a shouting match where no actual change is happening socially because it's just two camps yelling at each other, not changing each other's minds, not coming to an understanding. And meanwhile, people who identify themselves, for example, as centrist or centrist leaning, in a lot of ways vilified by the structural oppression storytellers as kind of implicitly supporting the alt-right because they're not doing what they need to be doing to redress the grievances.
If you're not with us, you're against us.
Yes, they're not. They have this perception that we need a far pole left to bring anything back to any semblance of center or normalcy at all. And so the people who identify as centrist aren't active enough, aren't left enough to bring everything back into balance because the world's on fire. And so I think that vilification of anybody in the moderate or center arena is also part of the structural oppression narrative.
Well, and it isn't even just moderation, it's complexity, right? I think that when when people have a sort of simple linear kind of causal model, or they've kind of decided that they're going to put people in buckets, that it's that complexity is perceived as waffling or weakness, or nuance is perceived as almost a betrayal. What's interesting, I think, is that you've got a set of moral emotions that get activated around this concept of loyalty and purity, which paradoxically, if we look at Jonathan Haidt's analysis of the left and right, he would say that loyalty and purity traditionally are part of the right-wing moral calculus, and not so much so on the left, that the left tends to be more about fairness and non-harm. But what we see kind of getting activated on the left is some very similar dynamics around kind of purity, loyalty, righteousness. And so questioning our orthodoxies, the kind of orthodoxies that our community has centered in on, gets perceived as a betrayal. And of course, for someone like me who's coming out of a religion, fundamentalist religion, that's very much scripted around orthodoxy and those kind of emotional dynamics, it can feel quite religious at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also came from a background of religious fundamentalism, and I see and recognize the same tendencies. It's harder for people who haven't had that background to understand and to recognize it. I think that this is extremely relevant and important to address and talk about because, as Amy Chua has argued in her new book, this affects globalization because we are a globalized society. This affects more than just our country and our way of life. It ripples out and has a worldwide impact, and we need to begin seeing our national identity in a way that transcends our political tribes, is her argument. And to do this, do you think that the Enlightenment liberal vision can be reconciled with the kind of post-structuralist, postmodern liberal visions, and if so, how?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think that the narratives are so incompatible as the then approach to social action is, right? So, when you talk about Enlightenment ideals, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that all people are created equal and deserve these things, right? And then if you tell a story that, wow, through human history, in fact, even since the Enlightenment, there have been these structures kind of built into our society that have prevented some people from being able to be fully equal or to experience their kind of shared humanity and their individual quests, right? And dreams and opportunities. Like, that's not incompatible. Like, those are two parts of reality. It's kind of hard to argue with either one of those, honestly. The difference is in terms of then, I think, the prescriptions that we pursue in terms of how we go at that and what grabs our hearts, right? So to me, the question is really where the tension lies in large part is when I see a person, do I look at them, do I see first and foremost a gender, a skin color, a social class, a sexual orientation, or do I kind of see a person, right? And then am I curious about kind of what that person's lived experience might be? Do I make assumptions about their degree of participation in society as either oppressed or as an oppressor based on those kind of check boxes? Or do I really kind of, and I'm saying either or, and it's wrong, right? Because to some extent, I think that those checkboxes do and should inform our hypotheses. And at the same time, that it's a struggle to kind of hold on to that, acknowledging that, and the kind of our unique individualism.
And we see this kind of played out in specific ways with the reaction to various books and articles. I'm thinking of the reaction of the structural oppression storytellers to Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now. There has been a very surprisingly harsh and visceral, hostile reaction to that book among some social justice activists because to them, he's not paying enough attention to the inequalities. He's paying too much attention to what's good already and how we can maximize that. And there's some valid criticism there. And then on the other side, there's books and authors like what Naomi Klein is writing about raising the whole structure to the ground, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There needs to be both, I think. It's not some zero game. And believing that it is plays into the very tribalism that we want to see diminished and to kind of go away, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to what I thought was a deep and fascinating discussion. At this point in the recording, we experienced technical issues that resulted in our internet connection being interrupted. Fortunately, we covered a lot of the ground that we had both wanted to cover in the space of the hour we had set aside. If you want to explore these ideas and issues further, I encourage you to check out Dr. Valerie Tarico's website, https://valerietarico.com, where you'll find, among many other interesting pieces, the 2 articles on political and cultural narratives she wrote that we talked at some length in this recording about. I will, of course, also include links in the show notes. I want to send out a heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tarico, if she is listening, for taking the time out of her day to record this interview with me for my podcast, and I would love to have you on again in the future to talk about any number of the interesting subjects you tackle. I would love to have you on, for example, to share your personal story of coming out of fundamentalist religious belief and the intellectual path you've taken to understand the psychology of religious fundamentalism and tribalism more generally. This story is told in Valerie Tarico's book, Trusting Doubt. A former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light, which I highly recommend to all my listeners. Again, links to all of this stuff will be included in the show notes. That is all I have for this episode. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from me soon. Here's the outro. Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussion this show is meant to encourage, you can find the official discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/A Leap of Doubt. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @thenatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The opening and ending music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. A very special shout out and heartfelt thanks goes out to my 4 patrons: Jeff Prebeg, Jeannie Eichard, Torsten Pill, and Chris Watson. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt.